Welcome again, everyone. Very pleased to have so many of you here with us today for the fourth session of This Is CDR. That's going to focus on ocean CDR pathways. This Is CDR, it's an online event series presented by OpenAir to explore the wide range of carbon dioxide removal solutions currently being researched, developed, and deployed to contextualize them for policy proposals under development for New York and for other states and jurisdictions. Some of you already have, but everyone please say hello in the chat and tell us where you're zooming in from. I'm Toby Bryce, based in Brooklyn, New York, and I work on CDR policy advocacy with OpenAir. If you're not familiar with us, some quick background on OpenAir. We are a distributed volunteer network dedicated to the advancement of carbon dioxide removal solutions necessary to solving the climate crisis. Our growing global community collaborates on shared open source missions in the areas of research and development, policy advocacy, and activist market development. There'll be a link in the chat. You're welcome. Please join us. We have a very robust conversation going on Discord and lots of different projects that you can plug into. Most of you who are here today are already familiar with carbon dioxide removal, but just very quickly from the top, CDR is the process of capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing it safely for a long period of time in the geosphere, the ocean, or in long-lived products. When considering CDR as we are today in this series, it's really important and essential, first and foremost, to emphasize that CDR is not in any way an alternative to reducing emissions. We have to reduce global emissions and decarbonize our economy as quickly and as completely as possible, full stop. That said, every credible climate forecast, including in very stark terms, the most recent IPCC assessment report shows that CDR will be required at gigaton scale by mid-century. That's billions of tons per year to counteract those emissions that are hard or inequitable to abate, and ultimately to start removing the tremendous amount of excess carbon dioxide humans have emitted into the atmosphere, so we can restore our climate to a safer and healthier state. If you're new to CDR, a great place to start, there's a link in the chat to the CDR primer, which is a fantastic document. Also, the previous sessions of this series are available on our YouTube channel, which will also be put in the chat. And of course, we're here today to learn more. Very pleased to welcome the Ocean Visions team to join us. Now, please meet my OpenAir colleague, Megha, who will introduce the session and today's presenters.
Hi, everyone. I'm Megha Raghavan. I'm based in London, and I also work on OpenAir's CDR policy advocacy team with a particular interest in some of legislative policy opportunities for California, where I'm from. This week, we're very happy to welcome Dr. Catherine Jadot and Dr. David Koweek from Ocean Visions to give us an overview of ocean CDR pathways and to discuss their scale potential for New York, including the opportunity to co-locate CDR with offshore wind, which we at OpenAir are very excited about. So a couple of notes before we get started. We're going to have a format starting with a 15 to 20-minute presentation, which will be followed by a few prepared questions and then moderated audience Q&A. So if you do have any questions throughout the session, please just type them into the Q&A box in Zoom. Just note that that's separate from the chat box, but if you put those in the Q&A box as you have them, we'll have Catherine and David answer them towards the end of the session. The event is being recorded, so we'll send that video link out to everyone who registered. We'll also post it to our OpenAir's website and to our YouTube channel. And we will also be live tweeting the event. So we'll put our Twitter link in the chat, and please follow along. If you tweet, the event hashtag will be hashtag This Is CDR. So for some quick intros and the main event, Catherine Jadot is program lead for Ocean Climate Solutions, and David Koweek is the science director for Ocean Visions, which is an inspiring organization founded to break down the silos that exist between research, universities, NGOs, foundations, business, and government, and to link research development and deployment processes within a unified framework, as well as to serve as a network to co-create and deploy equitable, durable, and scalable solutions to the growing crisis in our climate and our oceans. Kath and Dave, take it away.
Well, thanks, Megha, and thanks, Toby, for such a really great introduction. It's really great to see so much attendance here today. As Megha said, my name is Dave Koweek. I'm the science director of Ocean Visions, and I'll be joined here by my colleague, Kath Jadot, who's the program lead for ocean-based climate solutions. And I just want to say on a personal note, it's really great to be able to speak to this organization. I am a New York native. I grew up in Hudson, New York, and so to be able to come and speak with this audience is a really great opportunity to try to take some of the lessons I've learned and help the New York community as it develops its plans for CDR, research, development, demonstration, and policy. So today, Kath and I are going to speak with you a little bit about the work that we're doing at Ocean Visions to try to accelerate the research, development, and demonstration of ocean-based pathways to help meet some of the gigaton scale carbon dioxide removal requirements that Toby alluded to. Kath, next, please. So as Toby mentioned, the release of the IPCC's Working Group 1 report 2 weeks ago made it really clear that the only pathway to limiting and warming to less than 2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels involves the gigaton scale, that's billion-ton scale, deployment of carbon dioxide removal solutions. And I just want to make this point that 2 degrees warming is not a particularly inspirational target. You know, we're at 1.1 degrees of warming right now, and as we see evidence of all over the country, you know, this is a really dangerous spot to be in right now, and much less 2 degrees, especially when we think about the system being nonlinear. So whether that's the wildfires in Oregon or California, the heat wave in June in the Pacific Northwest that was statistically impossible without climate change, Tropical Storm Henry that just battered the Northeast, or the flooding that's occurring in Tennessee, you know, we really need to think really carefully about deploying these solutions as quickly as we possibly can, because 2 degrees C is certainly not a safe threshold. So it really begs the question, where do we get this carbon dioxide removal from? Next. And if you want to think about carbon dioxide removal, you have to be thinking about the oceans. And here's why. When you look at the global carbon cycle, and here we're showing the diagram from the IPCC's 5th assessment report, you can see that the oceans are by far and away the biggest lever in the carbon system. And that is because they store the vast bulk of carbon as dissolved inorganic carbon in the ocean. So the oceans store much, much, much more carbon than does the atmosphere. And if you want to be thinking about solutions to what is essentially a carbon problem, too much carbon in the atmosphere, have to be thinking about the oceans. Next. And the oceans could, and I want to emphasize that role, could play a big role in helping to clean up our atmosphere for several reasons. The first is that we live on a blue planet, not a green planet. The oceans occupy 71% of the planet's surface area. And so to be looking for CDR solutions that don't involve 71% of the surface area of the planet, to us, seems very foolish. We need to be thinking about using the planet in its entirety to help draw down atmospheric CO2. And as I mentioned, there's already this natural process where the oceans can sequester this really large amounts of carbon by buffering the carbon with alkaline molecules. There are fewer conflicts, or I should say potentially fewer conflicts in the ocean than on land. You know, if you're constraining your CDR activities to the 29% of the surface area of the planet that's on land, you already need to compete with lots of other land use needs, like agriculture, like cities, development, etc. And you know, there are existing marine industries, namely shipping and fishing, but there's the potential to have fewer conflicts on land. And finally, the last, I would say the last potential advantage of the oceans relative to land-based options has to do with permanence. And that's simply that the carbon that goes into the oceans cannot burn up. You know, as we're seeing with the wildfires in Oregon and California, if you are planning on using afforestation or terrestrial-based biological options to store excess atmospheric carbon dioxide, those can potentially burn up and they can return to the atmosphere and they can undo years of progress. So there seems to be some potential advantages with respect to permanence in the oceans. But all of these, all of what I've said really exists sort of as foundational principles that might help guide the research, development, and demonstration of these technologies. At their core, these technologies are at really low stages of technology readiness. And so what we're doing at Ocean Visions is trying to accelerate the learning curve so that we can make more well-informed decisions more quickly about the suitability of these technologies. And so to do so, we built technology roadmaps to accelerate the research, development, and demonstration of these technologies. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kath, who's going to tell you more.
Yeah, thank you, David. So as David said, for about 18 months now, Ocean Vision set up to develop multidisciplinary technology roadmaps that were really designed, to identify the state of readiness of the technology, all the obstacles and opportunities, but also the priorities for ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. So in this first year and a half, what we focused on was 3 large classes of ocean-based carbon dioxide removal technologies, including electrochemical approaches for carbon dioxide removal, microalgae cultivation and carbon sequestration, and ocean alkalinity enhancement. And from the very beginning, we recognized that it was not just about science, it was not just about engineering, it was also about public perception, governance, and communication. It's also about, expanding and unlocking finance and investments. So this is why we built two cross-cutting roadmaps, cross-cutting theme roadmaps, which are growing and maintaining public support for ocean-based CO2 removal. And the second is about expanding and unlocking finance and investment. And before we explore those roadmaps a little bit more, I just wanted to briefly review the three technologies that we cover in the technology roadmap. And the first one, which is probably the most popular, is to really harness the power of photosynthesis to potentially capture massive amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by expanding ocean productivity via large-scale farms of macroalgae. So it can be kelp or sargassum done in the open ocean. So here we are talking about industrial scale. Think about hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of microalgae farms in the open ocean. There's an analogy that Dave is using sometimes, and I really like it. This is a little bit like the Trillion Trees initiative, but for the oceans. And because the ocean covers 71% of the planet, there is a lot more surface area that can be used. And for the purpose of CO2 removal, so it's not only growing the algae, but it's also sequestering that CO2 that is in the biomass. So some teams are talking about, sinking the biomass into the deep ocean. Other teams are talking about bringing it onshore and potentially refining it for high-value products, high-value bioproducts, and then sequestering the carbon via a whole series of different processes like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage or pyrolysis. So it's not only growing the algae, but it's also sequestering the CO2 at timescales that would be relevant here. The second roadmap that we looked at is what people broadly call ocean alkalinization, or ocean alkalinity enhancement. And this is basically accelerating the natural geological processes that allow the ocean to store so much carbon dioxide in the first place. So there is a whole variety of pathways that can be implemented. And you might be familiar with coastal enhanced weathering or enhanced rock weathering or accelerated weathering of limestone. And it generally involves either crushing up carbonate or silicate rocks or producing alkaline minerals and then distributing them on the surface of the ocean or on the beach in order to increase the ocean's appetite or the ocean's capacity to absorb carbon dioxide. And finally, the third technology roadmap is closely related to alkalinization, ocean alkalinization. And it's basically using the tools in principle from electrochemistry to remove carbon dioxide from seawater. And again, you have different pathways that are possible and that have been proposed, and some even have been demoed at benchtop scales. And those pathways basically strip seawater into a portion that's more acidic and a portion that is more alkaline or basic. And then you can do a variety of things to capture the CO2 from the seawater and then return the carbon dioxide depleted seawater back into the ocean, where it can repeat the cycle and absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. So let's have a look. Oh yeah, and then finally, I wanted to talk about blue carbon, because this is a question that we get a lot. What about blue carbon? So blue carbon, if you don't know, it's all the coastal habitats, just seagrass meadow and mangroves and salt marshes. And these are really key ecosystems, and they're absolutely critical to have healthy oceans and for all the ecosystem services that they are providing. But although they do lock in a lot of carbon per unit area, when you actually look at the flux rates, which is the rates of carbon uptake that are really needed to generate the multi-gigaton scale per year of carbon dioxide removal that is needed, well, coastal blue carbon won't be sufficient. And we like to say that it is absolutely necessary, but it's not sufficient. So don't get me wrong, we absolutely need to continue our effort to protect and restore these ecosystems. And I, for one, spent a big chunk of my career restoring those ecosystems. But for the purpose of carbon removal, to solve the climate change crisis, we know now that there won't be enough. We have passed that window of opportunity. So let me go share the screen. So these are the roadmaps. So we wanted to create a website that was very dynamic and interactive. So each of these big technology roadmap or cross-cutting roadmap can be clicked on. And then you see in each for those roadmap, you have three main domains. You have the state of technology, the development gaps in need, and the first order priority. Again, each of the domain are clickable, and you can see the subdomain for each of them. Let's say that we click, for example, on here, measure the scale and impacts of CDR via macroalgae sinking. So you can see all the different information that you can have here. And the specificity of those maps is that we want them to stay cutting edge. We want them to be relevant to the research that is done today. So we are inviting users to actually comment, who actually even submit content for those roadmaps. So if you're working on a specific area, you can just highlight the text you want to comment on, and then hit comment, and then you can add your input on this. So we really want those to be to stay up to date. And this is also a great way for the community to be involved. But there are other ways that you can be involved. And I'm gonna hand over to David again, so he will detail how you can be more involved in this process. Dave?
Yeah, thanks, Kath. You know, these roadmaps are really about engaging a global community. And This Is CDR seems like a really great community that has a lot of diverse skill sets. And this is what we see constantly with interested folks. It's not just scientists and engineers, but it's really a broad group of interested stakeholders who are going to drive progress forward in this field. So let's talk about some of the ways, let's talk about some of the needs in these roadmaps. If you're a scientist or an engineer, these are the questions we get all the time. We need your expertise. We need help with developing a new class of sensors that are easy to use as flash drives and as reliable. We need new help with models and data model integration tools. We need help doing techno-economic analyses and life cycle analyses. And by the way, when I'm saying we, I'm not just saying Ocean Visions, I'm talking about the field of ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. Next, Kath. If you have expertise in policy, we need help synchronizing the push of RD&D with the pull of market demand. So we need help developing enabling regulatory frameworks. Where can people do field trials in local waters? And what role can subnational jurisdictions like New York do to help create these enabling environments? And then, of course, at a global scale, you know, as Kath mentioned, look, if we want to get to gigaton scale, it's almost going to certainly necessitate moving into international waters. And one of the big governance gaps there is that there are no explicit governance frameworks to govern CDR specifically. So there are aspects of other frameworks that touch on CDR, but I'm sorry. There are aspects of other governance frameworks that touch on CDR, but they are not explicit to CDR. And so developing explicit frameworks, I think, will be really critical. Next. We want to make sure that this community develops equitably. There's such a long history of underrepresented populations bearing disproportionate burdens as new technologies are developed and environmental solutions are piloted. So we want to make sure that from the beginning, we're building a broad and inclusive coalition so that the benefits can be equitably distributed across communities. Next. And one of the things that we didn't really touch on today is that many of these technologies that Kath talked about involve the production of co-products. And that's a really critical piece of the puzzle here, because it's these co-products that might be able to drive co-revenue streams, that might be able to lower system costs and make carbon removal much more affordable. So we really need help. If you have experience in business development, we really need help driving progress forward here so that we can help map out the market demand for these various co-products, help grow that market demand, and help lower overall system costs to make carbon removal even affordable. And that's just sort of, just a teaser of the different skill sets we need. There are lots of other specific needs that are listed on the first order priorities of these maps. And I just want to highlight that every single one of these roadmaps has a very clear set of first order priorities that engage people and will require people with skill sets that are not only in science and engineering, but as I said, policy, governance, entrepreneurship, philanthropy, conservation, regulation, et cetera. And so please come join us on this journey, and let's build together. Thank you very much for your time. And Kath and I would be thrilled to stick around and answer some questions.
Hey, thanks guys, that was awesome. We do have a bunch of awesome questions from the audience. One of the first questions we got, and I think you touched on this a bit when you talked about the sort of framework and policy around CDR. Someone asked, how can we prevent the kind of Wild West that's happened in the soil carbon markets from happening in the blue carbon market?
Well, I think we're at the pre-stage. We're still at the stage of research and development of these technologies. And so one of the things that we call out across the roadmaps is the need to basically build up the foundational science necessary to support the development of standards that can support third-party verification and the foundations for trading carbon removal credit to the ocean. So, with respect to ocean-based technologies, again, they're at an earlier stage of technology readiness. I think largely because it's hard to do things in the ocean, and also because for a lot of people, the ocean is sort of out of sight, out of mind. So we're trying to center the ocean, bring it back front and center in people's minds. But because of that, I don't think we're ready yet to stand up carbon removal credits, although we're trying as much as we possibly can to generate the necessary science to be able to do that as quickly as we can.
Cool. I'm going to hand it back to Toby, and he, I think, will take away the prepared questions, and then we'll come back.
Yeah, we just had a couple. Sorry about that. Number one, would love to hear Dave and Kath sort of how Ocean Visions thinks about quote unquote nature-based versus engineered carbon dioxide removal solutions. There's a lot of debate out in the world about it. There's a recent paper that we'll put in the chat by Shannon Osaka, Rob Bellamy, and Noel Castry entitled Framing Nature-Based Solutions to Climate Change that basically postulated that it's a bit of a false distinction. It's a not very useful distinction, and we'd be better off focusing on the specific characteristics of a given CDR solution in terms of its permanence, co-benefits, potential harms, costs, additionality, et cetera. Many of the ocean CDR solutions that you guys have referenced are kind of hybrid because they are certainly nature-based, but they also have an engineered component. So I don't know, can you guys talk about that a little bit and how you see that issue?
Sure, I can talk about that. I think, it's a false dichotomy because we need to look, like you said, at what the solution is doing, right? The first solution that we're looking at, microalgae cultivation, it's really harnessing the power of photosynthesis and the power of the sun. So it is, in a sense, a nature-based solution, right? But we need to amplify, we need to boost those solutions to get to the scale that we need to actually have an impact and potentially solve the climate crisis. So it is for us actually a dangerous dichotomy because we don't see the need to have the only natural solution and only engineered solution. It's not going to be black and white. It's going to be a blend of both. Dave, is there anything you want to add?
No, Kath, I think that was great.
Yeah, great answer. We referenced this in the sort of lead up. New York has a bunch of, or not a bunch, but several pretty large scale new offshore wind projects developing. And there seems like there's a great opportunity to co-locate ocean CDR with offshore wind for a variety of reasons, because there's a platform out there, because there's potential curtailed energy, et cetera. Dave, I know you have cautioned during the presentation and to me personally before that a lot of ocean CDR solutions are still in the research and development stage, but could you talk a little bit about what the sort of medium-term opportunity might be to co-locate ocean CDR with offshore wind and maybe some examples of what might be interesting?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the really exciting aspects of offshore wind is that it provides a stable source of energy. It provides it provides stable infrastructure. And so it might be a really great spot to help support some of this field trialing. And it also, sort of by definition, also is an area of the ocean that might not necessarily be conducive to other maritime spatial uses. So, I think there could be potentially really nice opportunities to integrate pilot scale macroalgae farms with offshore wind, or in particular, some of the electrochemical pathways that we talked about. Those all require really significant sources of electrical power. And so you might have this potential to be able to use excess power from offshore wind to power the pilot scale electrochemical processes and field trials in New York waters. And
do you think, obviously there is some conflict between offshore wind development and the fishery industry, for example. It seems like, are there some potentially, at least notional, co-benefits from some of these pathways with the fishery, like whether it's alkalinity enhancement or what macroalgae can do for its sort of larger environment?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. We didn't bring it up, but in each of the roadmaps, the environmental co-benefits and the environmental risks of every technology are highlighted, listed, referenced, and we hope to be able to continue to update these as more and more information comes out. But basically, all of these pathways have the potential to reduce ocean acidification locally. And so that has the potential to increase fisheries yields, especially for any fishery that is producing calcium carbonate skeletons. Then, a lot of folks are talking, especially with seaweed, about permaculture style benefits, that you grow the seaweed and that it supports a much more lively and active fishery in its vicinity. And so I think there are potentially a lot of synergies out here that could be win-win-wins.
Got it. That's great. Thank you so much. One more question, and then we have literally dozens of questions in the chat and the Q&A. So we're going to kind of flip it up to our audience and ask you guys some questions. But one thing I like to close these things on, we all kind of have our favorite solutions and projects. Could both of you speak to kind of an innovation that you're seeing in ocean CDR that gets you particularly and personally excited?
All of them?
Pardon?
All the different
innovations. Okay, fair enough.
I think that we are really in an early stage right now, and we really need to push every solution as far as we can. And there is so many innovation. It's absolutely wonderful to see, what is coming up. Almost every month you have something, a new component, that is added to make this field move forward. What I find the most exciting personally is that it feels like we are seeing, the birth of a new field of science. I feel a little bit like an explorer, and discovering new areas where you can really go, let your imagination go wide and find the best solution for the problem that we have at hand. So it's very exciting to see.
Fair enough. I can see how it would be difficult for you to pick just one, but is there one, Dave, that the audience might not know about that would be like as a good example of the innovation that we're seeing out in the sort of universities and research and marketplace?
There's one right in your backyard, Toby. Ocean Visions is pairing with a spin-off of Stony Brook University out of Matt Eisenman's lab at Stony Brook University. And it goes by the acronym CMATE, Safe Elevation of Alkalinity to Mitigate Acidification through Electrochemistry. That's quite the acronym, but Matt is a real world leader in using one of these electrochemical forms of CDR, specifically a form called electrodialysis. And this is a really innovative process. It's a process that can potentially remediate ocean acidification and support ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. And so Ocean Visions has been pairing with Matt's group to provide technical advising and evaluation. We assembled a team of advisors with expertise in engineering, marine ecology, sensor design, and quantifying carbon dioxide exchange between the atmosphere and the ocean. And they're giving the CMATE team, bespoke advice, or, functioning as a bespoke team to really help accelerate the learning curve for this technology. So I'm really excited about this. And, when you ask, oh, what are some of the potential technologies that might be able to pair with offshore wind, this is top of mind. And it's also, it's right in your backyard. So I think that's been really exciting.
Fantastic. And this was not scripted, but Matt is actually presenting on September 7th. So I think we put the link in the chat so you can learn more about CMATE in a couple of weeks. But thank you so much. Megha, do you want to start bringing out some of the questions from the audience Q&A?
Yeah, absolutely. We have quite a few already. So one of the questions we had was, when you're thinking about sinking macroalgae into the deep ocean, what are the issues you think about around that? Is there any danger of the CO2 being converted to methane? I know you guys work also with running tide and things like that. So just curious what your thoughts are about any potential side effects from sinking things into the deep oceans.
So we know that it's not going to come without a cost for the environment, right? But it's always a question of either we accept the potential cost, and benefit that we're going to have from that activity, or we just let CO2 completely disrupting our environment and leading to the catastrophic consequences that we know with climate change. So we are very much aware about the potential impact, positive and negative, that this solution will have on the environment. And we will make sure that we have the framework in place and everything in place, the experiment, the observation, before even thinking about deploying this at a larger scale. Yes, so this is something that the entire field is very aware of.
Yeah, makes sense. And I think, more broadly, how do you guys think about testing and sort of trying to test these kinds of solutions at a relevant scale before, really scaling them up? Or is that possible? Or is it more about modeling and trying to figure things out that way?
I'll take this one, Megha. I just want to build on what Kath was saying. So the questions about the environmental impacts of sinking seaweed are top of mind for everyone who's asking questions about sinking seaweed. And so this is a first order priority that's highlighted in our macroalgae map, developing a stronger scientific and technical basis to understand the potential impacts of sinking seaweed. And because we realized it was so important, we actually just released a call for self-nominations to build a working group that will help us jointly construct a research framework to answer key questions about the fate of carbon sequestered in the deep ocean and its environmental impacts. And the whole idea here is to bring together scientists, engineers, and practitioners to co-develop this research framework. So this research framework would have three things. It's going to have an asset inventory. What are the tools available to us to study the questions? This working group together will come up with a series of template experiments that'll be released publicly. And you can think about these template experiments as sort of cookbooks, cookbook recipes for doing experiments that can help you answer key questions like what was asked in the chat. What is the risk of producing methane if you deposit seaweed in the deep ocean? And the key here is to try to give the global scientific community a nudge towards reproducibility and able to interpair across studies, because it's through that decentralized production of independent scientific studies across species, across basins, through a worldwide network of scientists that will reach a better, more robust answer about the questions around the fate and impacts of sinking seaweed. And so this is really sort of a model forward for us about how to try to bring together different stakeholders to collaboratively solve problems. Our tagline is catalyzing solutions to ocean health. And the way that we think about catalyzing it is by helping to bring together different folks from different perspectives into the same room, and then facilitating those conversations to make linkages and advance progress faster than would have happened otherwise.
It makes a lot of sense. We had a question about how do you evaluate how much carbon is actually being captured by all these different approaches? And I think, from an open air perspective, in addition to being big in the policy space, we also have a lot of, citizen scientists and people who work on R&D, and I think they'd be really excited to hear about some of the sensors and things that actually get used to measure these carbon dioxide uptake levels.
Well, this is a very critical question, because of course we need to know exactly, the amount of CO2 that is removed from the atmosphere. But this is also one of the challenges that we have today. We don't have sensors that are sensitive enough to actually measure the amount of CO2 that is removed using those different technologies. So this is also highlighted as top priority in the roadmaps as one of the key elements that we need to move the field forward.
Great. I think there's going to be a lot of people listening who are excited to work on that kind of project.
It's a very challenging technical question. It's a very, very challenging technical question. There's really good theoretical understanding, first principles understanding about how the ocean and atmosphere exchange carbon dioxide. And therefore, if you capture carbon dioxide in the water, how the oceans should take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. But there's a difference with being able to measure it at really high spatial and temporal resolution. And so we're working to accelerate technologies, whether those are on the hardware side or software side, that can help fill in those observational gaps and be able to measure that additional carbon uptake at high spatial and temporal resolution. We think that's really sort of a first order importance for helping to stand up those standards that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, makes sense. And I think, I guess following on from that, one of the other questions we had was, some of these ocean operations might actually emit quite a lot of carbon to sort of run, whether using diesel or other fuels to actually run them. So how do you think about the carbon math, and what is roughly the net carbon dioxide that actually gets absorbed versus used in some of these projects?
I think that when we're going to be able to deploy those solutions in the field, in a control field trial, we're going to have to look at the complete life cycle of that experiment. You just don't want to look at one component. You really have to go from the very beginning to the very end of the pathway that you are implementing, and making sure that you plug in all the the addition and all the subtraction that you have for CO2.
Absolutely, yeah. Someone asked, what are the co-benefits of Blue Carbon project? Is there a good source of data? Is there some sort of a good list of what other impacts these kinds of projects can have?
When you say blue carbon, sorry, Megha, when you say blue carbon, do you mean all of the technologies that we talked about, or do you mean the coastal blue carbon habitats that Kath talked about in her presentation?
Well, the person wrote Blue Carbon. I think I'm interested to hear any and all of them, really.
So there's a pretty rich scientific, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, there's a pretty rich scientific literature out there about all of the ecosystem services that coastal blue carbon habitats provide, whether that's water filtration, decreases in pathogenic loads, stabilization of shorelines, critical habitats for nurseries, for ecologically and commercially important species, or aesthetic and cultural appeal. So, that's very well documented in the scientific literature. What's less well documented is, for some of these more nascent technologies that Kath talked about. And the reason is that these have yet to sort of make that kind of quantum leap beyond the computer scale or beyond the benchtop scale to have small scale field trials that are able to provide empirical data sets for which we can start to make statements about the potential, or about the environmental co-benefits and the environmental risks.
Right. And how advanced are some of these technical solutions? So, are they ready to scale up? Is there quite a lot of investment in R&D still needed for some of them?
Yes, there's a lot of R&D that is still needed. So most of them, some of them have been demoed at benchtop scale, but we haven't had any type of
there are some really strong natural analogs. So for instance, seaweed farming has been happening primarily in Asian countries for hundreds of years in coastal settings. And so there's a lot of accumulated intellectual capital around seaweed farming. The question though is what happens when you start to expand to large scales in the open ocean? That's something we haven't done yet. There's also a lot of really strong understanding about natural ocean alkalinization processes. But again, it's kind of this intentionalization of the process and the large sort of industrial scale that might potentially occur that we don't yet have a sort of clear understanding about. So what we're advocating at Ocean Visions is the acceleration of small scale controlled field trials. We're not talking about debuting technologies at hundreds of square kilometers or thousands of square kilometers, but we are talking about starting to get them in the water as quickly as possible with appropriate environmental and social safeguards. But sort of think about it at the hectare scale or tens of hectares, so that we can start to make more well-informed statements about what happens in actual field settings.
Right. Yeah. And so what do you see as the role of the private sector, given that these are all kind of nascent technologies, what kind of role does the private sector have in developing that and sort of bringing those kinds of trials to fruition?
Well, I'll start here, and then, Kath, if you want to jump in afterwards, great. There are some really interesting activities happening in the private sector. So I think probably almost everyone on this call is familiar with Stripe's advanced purchases, right? So Stripe is helping to create the pull of market demand that I talked about at the end of the talk. Then you also see commitments from really large multinational corporations like Microsoft to go carbon neutral over its entire history. You are seeing similar commitments coming from Amazon and from Netflix. United Airlines has announced that it's supporting direct air capture programs, I believe, in Texas. And so the private sector can play a really strong role in supporting the pull of market demand. And I think that's great. I do want to say also, though, that, we're not at the stage yet where with these ocean-based technologies, where we have the standards to be able to certify carbon removal, X tons of carbon removal guaranteed at a permanence of X years. And so we're trying as quickly as we can to do that and to generate the research and development that's necessary to do that, so that these markets can be stood up. And I think that's in line with the sort of philosophy of Stripe that's really supporting these kind of forward contracts or advanced purchases that are being used, where the money is being used to support R&D in exchange for the ability to purchase carbon removal at a future price later on.
Yeah. Which type of those things do you see as the biggest opportunity for some, exciting new startups to come in and actually do something big there?
I'm sorry, what do you mean? What do I see as the most exciting opportunity?
Just in terms of the different types of solutions, is there an area where you think, there's a big opportunity for someone to come in and start something that addresses a particular type of ocean solution?
I think we're seeing a pretty robust growth. I think we're seeing pretty robust growth in this space. It's almost like if we had this conversation 10 or 2 years ago, everybody would have been like, is there any activity in this space? And now, there's a huge proliferation of seaweed companies. You're starting to see ocean alkalinization projects spring up. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Project Vesta, electrochemical pathways. Toby said Matt Eisenman is going to come on. I'm sure also many of you are familiar with planetary hydrogen. And so, I just think this is a really exciting time in the space, and there's lots of entrepreneurial activity that's driving forward progress here.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to add also, if you go in the roadmaps and look at first order priorities, it could be seen as a little project by itself. So each item on those first order priorities could be an independent project with itself. So if people want to join in, that would be a great way to come into the field.
Great. And where sort of geographically do you think are there particular areas where there's like the most potential for these processes to work better in terms of, water temperature, tidal, current, other considerations?
I think it's really going to depend on the type of solution that will be implemented. You know, in some area will be better to grow macroalgae, and other area will be better to do, you know, other pathways. So I think it's difficult to have one solution that would go, you know, broadly everywhere. It's going to be really like cater to specific environments. But as Dave mentioned, you know, I've been working a lot in the Caribbean islands, and small island nations, I think, are perfect environment to maybe develop some type of pilot study or support, you know, that environment where you have that flexibility that larger nation maybe don't have. And also because small island nation, you know, there are the parties that emit the less CO2, but they are, you know, getting the first hit from climate change. So for an environmental justice standpoint, that would be absolutely fantastic if small island nation could embrace, you know, ocean-based CDR and help move forward the field.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. And I think it gets to what that question was really about, which is sort of where do we want to focus on trying to enact some policy changes that can actually foster ocean CDR. And small island nations, as you say, makes a lot of sense to sort of think about targeting first. Is there anywhere else in the world that you think is like a critical area we need to get those policies going to support this?
I think the US, you know, yeah, pretty much everywhere. But yeah, and I think also the US has a specific role to play just because it's still, you know, looked up by many nations. And if we do it right here in the US, it might trickle down and we can lead by example.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. All right. I think we're probably running close to the end of our time. So I'm going to hand it back to Toby just to close things out. But thank you guys so much. That was super interesting, at least for me. Really appreciate the presentation as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was really great. And thank you so much, Kath and Dave. I do want to just shout out again the Ocean Visions as an organization and the CDR roadmaps. We put those links in the chat, but they're really extremely well done. They're well designed digitally, and they have a tremendous amount of information. They also, I think, suggest great ways to get involved both individually and organizationally and commercially even. So it's amazing work you guys are doing, and thank you for it. And we're really very glad to have you here today. So thank you. Next week, we have a great presentation from Dr. Habib Azarabadi from Arizona State University. He works with Klaus Lackner there and at the Center for Negative Carbon Emissions. And he's going to tell us about direct air capture. And he also wrote a really great recent paper talking about how to scale direct air capture and from a technological perspective, the cost curves and the learning curves. So we're very excited about that. And then we have sessions coming up through the rest of the fall. So we have, as we mentioned earlier, Dr. Matt Eisenman on the 7th. We're going to be dark on the 14th because Climeworks has their direct air capture summit that day, which is amazing. So check that out. 21st, we have Dr. David Goldberg from Columbia, Lamont Doherty, and he's going to tell us about geologic sequestration. And there is kind of an ocean CDR and offshore wind tie-in because in New York State, at least, and kind of in the tri-state area, the best geologic sequestration opportunities are offshore, and they happen to coincide with offshore wind. 28th, we have Chris Magwood from Endeavor Center to tell us about carbon sequestration in the built environment, which again will be important in our region because we do not have very good terrestrial geologic sequestration opportunities. Christoph Butler from Climeworks will be here on the 5th, and then we have a bunch of other great sessions throughout the rest of the fall. So there'll be links in the chat to the series page and also to the registration for next week. Please also keep in touch with us by joining us on openaircollective.com or on our Twitter. And that's it. Thank you, Megha. And thank you again, Dave and Kat. That was really fantastic.
Thanks for having us.
It was a pleasure.